Do you know, I just spent, I don't know, maybe 35, 45 seconds trying to think about a good way to open this podcast, because I didn't want to just say welcome to the second episode of the Battle Camp podcast. I wanted to, get in there with a bit of oomph, and I just couldn't really think of a way to start it. I even almost googled what's a good way to start a podcast, but I decided against that. And now that I'm talking, I'm kind of thinking it might be worth having some form of theme music. Now, I own a guitar, but I don't know how to play it. And maybe now with all of this coronavirus stuff going on, it might be a good way to. It might be a good time to start learning how to play it. Aside from that, I just want to make it clear that is the first and last time I'm going to mention coronavirus during this podcast. Why? Because this podcast is all about how I got into MMA and boxing. I've been going back and forth with this guy I mentioned him previously. His name's Dara. Hold on, let me just get this right. I'm logging into my Instagram. Let me go into my Battle Camp account, because I've got two Instagram accounts. One's my personal and one's business. Business being Battle Camp. His name's Dara Connell. And Dara asked me, he kind of put together a few things that he'd like to know in terms of how I got into both sports. So I'm going to discuss that today. But before I get into it, I just want to quickly say, if you're watching this on YouTube, then I've got all of the links to different podcast platforms in the description of this YouTube video. So yeah, you can click on whichever app applies to you. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, blah blah blah. Whichever one you use, click on that link, and you can start listening to it. Subscribe to me, and then you can start listening to these podcasts on those podcast apps, because I'm going to be uploading these to the podcast apps a few days before I put it on YouTube, just because it's a lot easier to get it on there, especially when it's longer videos. It takes a while to get stuff on YouTube. But anyway, so I planned to record this yesterday. Today is Wednesday, the 25th of March, and I planned to record it yesterday, and I wasn't able to. And the reason is, here's a little story for you guys. I ordered myself a brand new laptop. Well, it's not really a laptop. It's a Surface Pro, so it's kind of a hybrid between a tablet and a laptop, because I ordered the keyboard that you can attach to it as well. Anyway, so I was sat at home because obviously the coronavirus is in town, and I was working from home yesterday. And at about quarter to four. Actually, no, this wasn't yesterday. This was on Monday. Sorry, my mistake. This was on Monday. About quarter to four, I get an email saying your package has been delivered, and it's been signed for by someone called Ash. And I thought to myself, well, my name's not Ash, and I haven't signed for this. Nobody in my house has signed for this. And I was a little bit like, what the hell's going on here? So I went downstairs, and I was like, where's my laptop? And then so I've got a porch, and for those of you that are American listening to this, our porches are different to yours from what I understand. So I've basically got two front doors. So I've got a front door, and it's like a little room where people leave their shoes and stuff like that, and then I've got another door with what you use to enter the house. And then I opened the first door, and I looked in my porch, and my laptop was there on the floor. And I'm thinking to myself, how did that get in my house? So I go to the first door, the front door, have a look, and it's not open, it's closed the way it should be. I look up, and I notice probably about just under, 6.5 foot, 7 foot off the ground, the window's open. So the delivery guy from UPS decided that the best course of action, as he was approaching the property that I live in, was to, rather than do the doorbell like a normal human being, he decided to throw my laptop that I spent £1,300 on through that window. And I looked at the outer packaging, and it was all scuffed up. I opened the packaging up, and my heart sank, because there was no kind of protective, I don't know what polystyrene, I think it is, like the protective white stuff holding the laptop in place. So yeah, there was nothing protecting the laptop or the Surface or the Hybrid or whatever the fuck it's called. Um, I opened the laptop up, I switched it on, and it just kept crashing and crashing and crashing. So basically, I wasn't able to set it up. I wasn't able to log into my OneDrive. I wasn't able to apply my Office 365 account to the device. So yeah, I had to get on the phone to Microsoft to get them to pick it up. I had to get on the phone to UPS and complain. I wrote the first ever strongly worded email that I've ever written in my life the other day to UPS, just describing how fucking stupid this driver is. I was honestly, I just couldn't fathom. I just couldn't fathom it. I couldn't understand, like, what was the thought process behind him doing that. It just didn't make any sense to me. I phoned UPS up, and the lady that I spoke to, she was actually really helpful. She was really good, to be fair. And I spoke to her. I told her, I described to her what I kind of thought had happened. Basically, him throwing the laptop through the window. And she said she goes, okay, let me put you on hold. Let me speak to the driver. Put me on hold, and she rang me. Well, she took me off hold, and she goes, I've just spoken to the driver, and he said that there was a lady who was hurrying. Kind of, she seemed like she was in a rush, and she was going into the property. So he decided to follow her and just leave the laptop on the floor. And I went, and then so he didn't think to get her to sign, or he didn't think to tell her that he had left the laptop there. And then she goes, and I go, furthermore, the only lady that would have been in my property at that time is my mum. And she hasn't left the house because, in case you don't know, there's this thing called the coronavirus going on, and we've been told not to leave the house unless you're going shopping or going, for a walk or whatever. And my mum didn't do any of those things yet today, so he's lying. So she goes, all right, cool. Let me speak to the supervisor and let me get some more information from him. I'll call you back. She called me back in about half an hour, 45 minutes later. And then she goes, oh, the driver said that he got muddled up with properties, and it wasn't your property that he was thinking of when he mentioned there was a lady going back inside. And what it is he came and he was knocking on the door for ages, and then he does remember the window. But then, yeah, nobody answered the door, and I went, so okay, so how is he saying that the laptop got into my property? How did it get into my porch? Oh, he can't remember. He's not sure. Yeah, exactly. So that's what I've been doing over the last couple of days. That's what I've been doing. But anyway, look, I've got myself a Surface Pro. I've had it replaced. I'm using it now to record this. So hopefully the quality of the sound is good, and I hope you can hear every last word I am saying. Right, that's enough of that. So let me just look at. I've got some. So actually, to be fair, I thought about making notes. I thought about actually really thinking about this, all of the questions that young Dara asked me, and I thought, okay, shall I make notes about this? Shall I really think about it and be specific about specific fights and dates and things of that nature? And then I thought against it because, like, when I'm kind of, if you consider kind of talking about like the best fight I've ever seen and stuff like that, it's too hard. My favorite fights, like I've seen literally thousands of fights, and it's too hard for me to say this is my favorite fight ever or this is my top 5 fights of all time, because it's just like I'd have to literally go through kind of footage and even like Wikipedia and BoxRec and ShareDog and stuff like that, and go through each event when it comes to MMA, and then go through boxing events, and like it's just too fucking hard. It's too difficult. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to list off some of the most memorable fights that I've seen and give you reasons why they're memorable. Aside from them being, entertaining fights, I'm just going to kind of give you a bit of background why I hold them so high up in my in my kind of regards when it comes to me looking back on fights that I've really enjoyed watching. But before I do that, let me answer the first question that young Dara asked me, and that was, how did you get into boxing and MMA? So, look, for me, both the reason why I'm such a big fan of both of these sports is because growing up, I was a massive, massive, massive fan of wrestling. And when I say wrestling, I don't mean actual, Olympic style wrestling. I mean WWF, which then turned into WWE. I mean WCW. I mean sports entertainment. I mean fucking wrestling. So much so that I actually, like, when I started working, I I actually bought tickets to WrestleMania. I went to WrestleMania in Florida. I wonder what WrestleMania. Look, I'm gonna Google this now. Actually, I can't remember which one it was. It was when Floyd Mayweather fought, in inverted commas, Big Show. So I'm just having a look now. I'm just googling this. WrestleMania 24. It was WrestleMania 24 I went to. What year was that? How old was I? That was in bloody hell 2008. Fuck. It seems like yesterday. But yeah, 2008 I went to WrestleMania. But obviously I was into boxing and MMA quite heavily by this point. So if I go back in my memory bank, so yeah, I was a massive fan of wrestling. I loved sports entertainment. And when you get to an age when you kind of come to terms with the fact that wrestling is premeditated, they're not really punching each other, not really kicking each other. Um, I came to that realization obviously at quite a young age, but I just still found it entertaining. For me, the Attitude Era, that was like the golden era of wrestling, with The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin and Triple H and Mick Foley, or Mankind, or Dude Love, or Cactus Jack. That was the era that wrestling for me was peaked. And then on the other side, you had WCW with NWO, and it turned to NWO Wolfpack and Red and Black and Black and White and whatever else. The Monday Night Wars era, I suppose, is what you'd call it. But yeah, so that I was just a huge fan of all of that. And at the same time, I was acutely aware of combat sports, real combat sports, because I knew, all right, this is fake, but there's actually people that really fight. And I didn't know a lot about boxing. I didn't really know a lot about I was a kid at the end of the day, but I was a real casual fan of boxing. And what I remember, one of my earliest memories of boxing was Prince Nassim Hamid, Chris Eubank. Although looking back, Chris Eubank was kind of at the tail end of his career when I was aware of who he was, because these guys were on were on TV, like not just as boxers in boxing matches. They were just celebrities. But my favourite fighter as a child was Lennox Lewis. Obviously being a big kind of British heavyweight. Obviously also Frank Bruno. I remember Frank Bruno from when I was a kid. But growing up, my favourite fighter was Lennox Lewis. And I remember when Lewis fought Tyson, and there was that massive kerfuffle they had at the press conference, and it was such a grand scene of Lennox Lewis. It was like and I might be wrong because I'm just talking from memory. I haven't gone back to watch this or Googled it or whatever. This is just me telling you guys what I remember, and I'm well aware of the fact that my memory may be incorrect. Do you know what I mean? But from what I remember, when that fight got announced, Lennox Lewis, it was like a stage there was on, and it was like a black backdrop. And it was almost like on the stage, there was like two platforms on top of the stage. And Lennox Lewis was stood on one, and Mike Tyson was stood on the other one. But they were quite far apart, maybe 10, 15 feet apart. And I can't remember what happened, but there was like this massive kerfuffle on the stage, People like all of Lennox Lewis's team, and then Mike Tyson's team came, and there was like, you know, a bit of a brawl, just put a bit of a push and pull, as Carl Froch would say. But yeah, that was one of my earliest like I remember watching boxing before that, because I think I was probably in high school when the Lennox Lewis Mike Tyson. You know what? Let me just actually check this. Let me just see what year this is. Um, I'm 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 not sure whether this is entertaining for people listening to me Google things, but it's going to happen a lot. It's going to happen a lot during this podcast, because it's quite fun for me, to be fair, just kind of looking back on things. So 2002, uh, yeah, I was in high school then. So yeah, I was in high school then. So that means it's not obviously the first fight I ever watched, but it's my the strongest memory that I have in the sport. And one of the things that I really, 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 for some reason, it really resonated with me was, it was like the way they wrote it. It was Lennox Lewis, and then underneath they wrote Vice Mike Tyson. But in Lewis, the IS was a different color. So say Lennox Lou was in white, and then the is was in red, and then V's Mike Tice was all white, and then the on in Tyson was red. So it's like Lennox Lewis V's Mike Tyson is on, and that fucking blew my mind as a child. I remember looking at that and then clocking the colours and realising that they're saying Lennox Lewis v Mike Tyson is on. And fuck me, I just thought, man, that's probably the cleverest thing I've ever seen in my life. I don't know why. It's quite a basic thing, but I just remember thinking, oh man, that is so clever. Maybe because I got it, and like when you kind of understand something, you just in your head think, oh yeah, just because you understand it, you think it's clever, like more intelligent than it actually is. I think that was the situation for me. But yeah, that's one of my earliest memories in boxing. I remember watching Prince Nassim Hamid fight. One of my favourite memories as a kid, kind of. But I was at a point now at this when this fight happened. I was at a point where I was more aware of boxing, boxers, weight classes, the different governing bodies within boxing. I was still a very casual fan, but one of my favourite fights, because I was kind of aware of it in the build up. I was kind of aware that this fight is going to happen, and it's a massive test, and the guy fighting is a massive underdog. And then when the actual fight happened, the underdog being Joe Calzaghe schooled Jeff Lacey, because Jeff Lacey was like the being built as like this Mike Tyson type character in, I think, the middleweight or the super middleweight. I can't remember what division that was in. Maybe super middleweight. I can't remember now. But that fight, I was kind of a little bit aware of it in the build up. But then it happened, and then when it happened, I remember I didn't watch it live. I remember watching it the next day or a couple of days after or something, and I think it might have even not even been on a sports channel. I think it was like on BBC One or something like that. Which for the American people listening to, that's like a terrestrial TV channel. It's like everyone gets it. You don't have to pay extra for it. Um, but yeah, I remember watching that fight, and I remember thinking, blimey, that Joe Calzaghe, like just being amazed by that performance that he put in. And I've been a fan. I was a fan of Joe Calzaghe ever since then. And obviously he retired unbeaten, and he had some big fights towards the end of his career. So yeah, so that's my kind of earliest. They're not my earliest memories, but they're the most kind of vivid memories I've got of boxing, boxers, fights as when I first got into the sport. Um, when I actually, what I give most credit to, of me being an avid fan of both sports, boxing and MMA, is people that create content on YouTube. So the reason why I really, really, really got into boxing, and I give these guys a lot of credit, is IFL TV on YouTube. Um, they so actually there's a combination of things. So it's IFL TV, a guy called Wingy. UK Wing Chun Student was his channel on YouTube, and Hatman. So his original channel was just Hatman, I think, and then he made a new one called Hatman Strikes Back. And IFL, Hatman, and Wingy were the three reasons why I became a fanatic about boxing. To this day, I admit I'm not a boxing kind of aficionado to the extent where I can break down a fight and I can watch a fight happen and then tell you why fighter A is beating fighter B and what adjustments fighter B needs to make in order to have more success in the next round, right? I don't know enough about boxing from a technical standpoint. I've never put a pair of boxing gloves on in my life. But I'm still a massive fan of the sport. And the reason why I'm a massive fan of the sport is the characters in the sport. And although I hate the politics in boxing, the politics is what really drew me into the sport. And IFL played a massive part in that because as I was kind of on the cusp of becoming well, no, actually, I was already a big boxing fan, but there wasn't enough content around boxing apart from Fight Night on Sky Sports or whatever channel I was watching on, for me to really kind of understand how the sport works outside of the ring. And when IFL came along, and then they started off first just kind of getting a couple of minutes here and a couple of minutes there at press conferences, and things of that nature, and kind of on Fight Night, etc., with boxers, promoters, not politicians, journalists, etc. And that kind of introduced me to the personalities behind the scenes, and also just the personality of fighters. And the first fight I can remember where I got the full IFL experience and the full kind of experience of independent content creators influencing how much information or kind of the knowledge I was able to gain about a fight, along with the broadcaster providing content as well. I think the first fight I can say that I had that full experience with was George Groves against James DeGale, which was a massive domestic fight over here in the UK. These were two guys that were domestic level fighters, fighting on pay-per-view. I think they sold out the O2. And yeah, so you had Wingy, who kind of done more of what I do, just kind of gave his opinion on different things going on in boxing, and he was quite funny, and he was he was a good character. You had Hatman, who kind of spoke more of the technical. He covers everything, but what I really enjoy with Hatman is him talking kind of almost like a pundit, like breaking down fighters, strengths, weaknesses, really giving you an insight of the capabilities of fighters in a fight, and breaking down the skill set to kind of, it gives you something to look out for during the fight, and it really kind of help me understand the sport more and understand more about fighters and kind of promoters, etc., etc. And then you had IFL TV talking to the actual fighters, talking to promoters, talking to people involved, and that kind of obviously provided more context and more of an understanding of what was going on, and kind of just drew me in more. It just kind of made me more of a fan. So those three, along with the content that Sky Sports were putting on, because I remember they used to have this this program called Ringside, and I remember they had James DeGale and George Groves sitting there kind of just going back and forth and stuff like that, and that was really entertaining. So yeah, that's kind of my journey when it comes to boxing. When it comes to MMA, I'd say I'm a bigger fan of the sport of MMA than I am boxing. And the fight that I remember, so I became aware of the UFC a couple of ways before I actually saw a fight. The first thing that I remember was there was this character in Friends who Monica was going out with, and I forget his name, but he was like this billionaire guy, tech guy, and he decided he wanted to be an Ultimate Fighter. And so that was kind of, I think that might have been the first time I'd heard the term Ultimate Fighting Championships. And I think in that episode of Friends, Bruce Buffer was actually in there introducing him. And then I remember Method Man. So I was obviously a massive, or still am, a massive fan of rap. And Method Man put out a solo album, and one of the lyrics that he says is UFC Ultimate Fighting Championships. What was the song? 1, I was born in the mind. 2, take the head of a snake. 3, and step into millennium. Yeah. Anyway, I can't remember the name of the song. It was a good tune, to be fair. But I'm pretty sure in that song, Method Man mentions Ultimate Fighting Championships, UFC Ultimate Fighting Championships. But I can't remember what the next bar is or what the bar before that was. But I do remember him mentioning it. And that was at a time when we first got the internet at home, and I googled Ultimate Fighting Championships, and I kind of was aware. I think this might have been before YouTube was a thing, so there wasn't really anywhere you could go online to watch videos and stuff like that, or anywhere online where you could watch videos about UFC. You could definitely watch videos about other things. But yeah, so there was that. And then the first fight, which was a few years after this, all of this, by the way, so this might have been even 5 or 10 years after. Um, the first fight I remember watching was Tito Ortiz against Ken Shamrock. But it wasn't the first one. They fought 3 times, I think. Let me look. I'm gonna Google this now. So let me just look at Tito Ortiz's. Oh, look, there's a dedicated Wikipedia page for Tito Ortiz vs Ken Shamrock. So it went UFC 40. It might have been. I remember Tito Ortiz beat the shit out of him. And I have a feeling it was Ortiz v Shamrock 3, the final chapter. And that was back in October 2006. So I would have been 20 years old at that time. I was born in 1986. So I was 20 years old when I saw that fight. And back in the day, there was a channel over here in the UK called Bravo, which no longer exists. And Bravo was a channel that was aimed at men between 18 and whatever age. So a lot of their content was kind of, cars and stuff that men like. And the UFC was one of the things that they had on. And I was aware of the UFC, and obviously this was in an era where you couldn't just hit a button on your remote to record something or whatever. You had to kind of watch it when it was on, unless you had your VCR kind of hooked up to your TV. And yeah, so I remember being hot. Like I remember coming across this fight, and Bravo didn't put fights on live. So say this happened on a Saturday. Sunday, the following day, Sunday at 9 p.m. or whatever, they'd show the fights. And yeah, I saw. And going back to what I was originally talking about me being a fan of wrestling, obviously Ken Shamrock was in the WWF for a while. So I remember seeing Ken Shamrock, and I thought, oh yeah, I remember him. And I was aware, again, because of wrestling, that Ken Shamrock was the most dangerous man in the world, and that he came from the UFC. So, like I said, I was aware of the UFC. I just had never seen it. Probably didn't even know that it was on TV in the UK until I came across that fight. And ever since then, I've been hooked. I watched that fight, and that was the first time I believe I saw, kind of elbows being thrown, or kind of actual wrestling with ground and pound and stuff like that. And fuck me, man, my mind was genuinely blown. I was like, man, this is brutal. This sport is crazy. And what made me appreciate MMA so much is I give Joe Rogan a lot of credit for that, because initially I just enjoyed it for just because I felt like it was a brutal, crazy sport, and these guys are actually going there and fighting. You know, with very, very, very limited rules. Um, but then the more I watched it, and the more I watched people exchange in kind of jiu-jitsu, wrestling, grappling transitions, and listening to Joe Rogan explain what's going on and why, you know, fighter A is moving in that direction and why fighter B is trying to move in that direction, and why fighter A is maintaining a grip of fighter B's wrist, and why fighter A is trying to get his leg over into that position, blah blah blah. It became fascinating to me. It genuinely became like the ground game is what actually kind of what really gripped me. Like the more I started listening, like it made sense. Like I could see, okay, well I can understand why he's doing that now, because Joe Rogan obviously was explaining it, but then like seeing him do it in front of me as well, it kind of, yeah, it all kind of made sense. And obviously, um the being a stat, obviously, like my initial instinct, or the reason why I kind of really got drawn to it was a stand up. And so now that I enjoy both elements of the sport, there was effectively nothing holding me back. So I remember at that time, Bravo, or I don't know whether Bravo just stopped existing, or whether Setanta, there was a channel in the UK called Setanta that came over from Ireland, and I was subscribed to Setanta because they started getting rights for a lot of kind of big boxing matches. So David Hay, I remember David Hay. The day I subscribed to Setanta, how's that? I remember actually phoning up to subscribe to Setanta. It was when David Hay fought um, Enzo Macronelli. So I can actually tell you the date. Yeah, if I Google this. No, let me do David Hay because I can spell that. I can't spell Macronelli. Give me 1 second. Let me just tell you. I can tell you the date that I that I subscribed to Setanta, and why this is key is because I subscribed to Setanta because I was obviously a fan of boxing, uh, but then they won the rights to the UFC, and that was 8th of March 2008. And the reason why I remember this so clearly is because the fight was actually on at like 2 or 3 a.m. in the UK, even though they were fighting in the UK at the O2 Arena, um, which was I don't actually know why that was, but that's what happened. Let me just check this because I might be misremembering this. I just want to make sure. Uh, um, London's O2 Arena. It. All right, fuck it, don't say it. But anyway, in my head, I think this fight happened at like 2 or 3 in the morning, and I remember coming home drunk, and I ordered Satanta, and and then before the actual fight happened, I fell asleep, and I hadn't recorded it, and I just had to watch it like the next day or whatever. But yeah, and then so the UFC started coming on Satanta, and that was it. I literally used to stay up most Saturday nights watching either boxing or MMA. So that's kind of how I got into both sports, and I hope this hasn't been. This sounds like it might be quite boring for people to listen to, but we are where we are. So yeah, those that's kind of my earliest memories of both sports and what kind of drew me into them and why I follow both sports. Um, my favorite fighter. So I've already mentioned a couple of names: Lennox Lewis, Prince Nassim Hamid, and Joe Calzaghe in boxing. Those guys were like my favorite fighters, kind of growing up. When it comes to MMA, my initial kind of favorite fighters were Nick Diaz. Nick Diaz has always been one of my one of my guys. I've always been a massive fan of Nick Diaz. I've always been a fan of how he's conducted himself outside of the cage, the way he kind of carries himself, the way he speaks. I've just always been a massive fan of his. I've always been a big fan of Dan Hardy and Michael Bisping, obviously because they're both British. But I don't know, I just like both of their personalities and their fighting styles, and I always supported them when they fought. who else? BJ Penn. BJ Penn's a guy that initially I liked, but then when I kind of started looking back at the history of MMA and stuff that he had done, and I missed him leaving UFC and then coming back and stuff like that. That was before my time. But looking back, I just gained more respect for him. And then I remember like he just went on this run, this crazy run of like when he beat Kenny Florian and he beat Sanchez and he beat, who was it, Sean Shirk. Those I can't remember exactly the names, but I remember that was like kind of at the beginning of me watching MMA, and I just remember BJ Penn just being this guy at 155 pounds that was unstoppable. And I was just a massive fan of his, man, because when I first saw him walk into the cage, and it might have been the fight when he beat Hughes, I saw him and I thought to myself, who this guy can't, like, he didn't look especially strong from a muscular standpoint, you know, and his face was just like, he didn't look very threatening. He didn't look like he could do damage until you actually saw him fight and actually fucking do damage. Do you know what I mean? And I loved his shorts, man. I loved his white shorts with a black belt that was kind of printed on there. Yeah, man. I've always been a big fan of BJ Penn. Um, who else in Frankie Edgar? Frankie Edgar. I'm gonna come on to him in a little bit because I want to talk about my favorite fights. But Frankie Edgar, like he just doesn't know how to give up. I was just a huge fan. I still am of Frankie Edgar, and like and the reason I was and not so much his person. The reason why I'm a big fan of Frankie Edgar is not so much his personality, but just because he kind of, so many kind of exciting fights and exciting moments he's been a part of. Yeah, he's been a big part of my kind of experience as a MMA fan. I really enjoy the content that the UFC used to put out kind of back in the day, like, you know, the countdown shows and stuff like that. They used to, I think it was just called Countdown. They used to do like a 24/7 type show that they do in boxing, or primetime type show, or I think actually it was called UFC Primetime because the current show is called Countdown. But Primetime was basically like a 3 or 4 part documentary on the run up to a big pay-per-view fight, and it was usually GSP in there. Like the prime time for GSP against Nick Diaz, the prime time for GSP against Dan Hardy. Um, they were good shows, man. It kind of helped me really understand the background to some of these fighters and stuff like that, and I really enjoyed them. And yeah, the UFC stopped doing them, but you know that's a different story. Um, but okay, so my favorite. So that's kind of covered off my favorite fighters. It's hard to say, man. I've had different kind of favorite fighters in different eras of the sport, but just off the top of my head, those are the names that I can think of. My favorite fights. Um, my favorite fights. One of them. I'm gonna do MMA first, and I'll talk about boxing a little bit. So MMA. Nick Diaz against Daly. That for me is one of the most exciting fights I've ever seen. Um, and that was in an era where I was a massive fan by then, and I was aware of Strikeforce. I was aware of the history of Pride. I was aware of Dream, because Dream, I think, around that era was an organization that was in full flight. But yeah, that fight was epic. It had everything. It was exciting. Um, and I remember watching or seeing a video on YouTube of both of the guys, like the day after the fight, or the night of the fight, but after the fight in a hotel, kind of just having a conversation. And like in my head, Paul Daly and Nick Diaz are both very volatile characters. And watching that, I was just shocked that how come they're being so nice to each other. Just all of the stuff that they said beforehand, and then actually they had a fight, obviously, and then them two just being so cordial and nice to each other in a hotel afterwards. I was shocked by it, to be honest with you, and that was just me being a little bit naive, I suppose, as a fan of MMA. But that's a memory that sticks out in my head. But that fight was definitely sticks out. It's very memorable to me. Another fight that just off the top of my head that sticks out a lot is is Pat Barry against Czech Congo, and I have a feeling that fight night might have been on a Sunday night. So I effectively was watching it on a Monday morning, and I had work that day. And I remember watching that, and I might be wrong. Again, my memory might be wrong here. But I remember watching that fight, and I just remember being like, "What the fuck am I watching?" And I remember this is now in an era where I could record content on my Skybox, and I remember showing people like, "Watch this." Like, I think I showed my old man, and I showed my brother who didn't give a shit about MMA. It was just something that I had to show people. Like this is crazy. Like, this fight is fucking crazy. So if you haven't seen it, and I'm not gonna give away what happened or how it happened, I don't want to spoiler alert you guys, but I definitely recommend going away and watching that. Um, Frankie Edgar. So both his fights against Gray Maynard, the first one and the second one, like, that for me is the epitome of why mixed martial arts is my favorite combat sport. It genuinely had everything: a title on the line, um, back and forth. One guy's winning, then the other guy looks like he's winning. It was honestly like I can't sit here and tell you what I was doing in that era or even what year it is, but I can vividly remember like the feelings that I had whilst watching the first fight and then the second fight. For some reason, Gray Maynard always rubbed me up the wrong way, and I don't know why. It's just unreasonable on my part saying that, but I just never liked Gray Maynard, and I have maybe he said something in an interview, or he behaved in a certain way in an interview that rubbed me up the wrong way. Maybe it was just because I was a fan of Frankie Edgar. I don't know, but for some reason, I never liked Gray Maynard, so I really, really, really wanted Frankie Edgar to win. Um, both times they fought, and they both put on a really, really, really exciting show for us, the fans. Yeah. Another memory that sticks out was, and this wasn't so much, about the fight being exciting, but it was Clay Guida against Diego Sanchez, and I think it was at like an Ultimate Fighter show or something, like a finale, and they were on the card. But the opening round of that fight was fucking nuts. It was bananas, and just those two characters. And if you're kind of unaware of them as characters, and how they kind of enter the octagon and stuff like that, go back and watch that. And I wish, you know what, I might actually invest in Fight Pass, because there's so many fights that I think about that I just have no way of watching again. Do you know what I mean? But that fight has always stuck out in my head. Uh, um, Clay Guida against Sanchez. That was a fucking that was a madness. That fight was, honestly, it was complete and utter madness. And a couple of others, a couple of Conor McGregor fights really stick out in my memory. The first one being his fight against Chad Mendes, because that was, for me, I think it might be the first and last time where they had actual um, live singers live at the arena sing for the entrance of both fighters. So Conor McGregor and Chad Mendes, and I remember like having butterflies before that fight started, and I remember just genuinely not knowing what's going to happen here, and I remember being utterly surprised by the fact that Conor McGregor beat Chad Mendes, and just kind of being like, taking my hat off to him and saying he's the real deal. He is the real deal. And that fight, just the whole pageantry of the event, really sticks out in my memory. And the other Conor McGregor fight that sticks out in my memory was the Nate Diaz, the first one against Nate Diaz, because by now the infrastructure online, etc., was there. There were so many different channels and personalities, the Ariel Helwanis of the world, and there's so many different outlets that I could go to for content around MMA, and like the build up to that fight was like, it was mad for me. Like, I really enjoyed it, and I was really looking forward to this. And that fight, the build up to it started when Nate Diaz beat Johnson, And Conor McGregor, I'm gonna fight your fucking ass because you're taking everything I work for, motherfucker. You wanna fight these motherfuckers? Basically, that whole thing that he just went out on. And it was on. Since then, it was like that was the fight I wanted to see. And I was glad Nate Diaz had stepped up. And I actually remember during the fight week, they was doing their media kind of day. And Nate Diaz was a bit pissed off because his name wasn't, or his face wasn't on the poster behind. Like he wasn't even mentioned on, like, as a fighter on the card, on the poster. And you know what? I'm actually gonna fucking Google this because I can't remember who headlined that show. So I know obviously Nate Diaz fought Johnson, but I want to know who else was on that show, because, like, this was around the time where Dana White was telling people that Nate Diaz isn't a needle mover, and people like me were sat there saying, no, he fucking well is. He is a needle mover. What are you on about? Like, do you know what I mean? Um, but Dos Anjos v Cerrone 2. So you had Dos Anjos v Cerrone, Overeem against Junior Dos Santos. Yeah, and I'm just looking at the poster, and it was that Dos Anjos against Cowboy 2, and so that's why Nate Diaz wasn't on the poster. But fuck me, Nate Diaz, he put on a show against Johnson, and then he stole the show with that post fight promo that he did, and then soon after that he fought. Let me have a look. Was it his? Yeah, it was his next fight. So that was on December 19th, my mum's birthday, 2015, March 5th, 2016. He fought Conor McGregor, and full disclosure, I wanted Nate Diaz to win that fight. I was supporting Nate Diaz. He's so just by default of me being a Nick Diaz fan, I was a Nate Diaz fan to start with. But then I saw Nate Diaz's personality come out more, in the build up to the Donald Cerrone fight, when he fought Donald Cerrone, and then he obviously had a few other fights after that. He had a couple of losses against Benson Henderson, and Josh Thompson knocked him out. But in that period when he fought Michael Johnson and became more vocal, and he kind of just took that Conor McGregor fight. And I know Conor McGregor was supposed to fight Rafael dos Anjos, and he got injured, and then Nate Diaz was a late replacement or whatever. But he put himself in that position by saying the stuff that he did. And when he got that position, he took it. He took his opportunity. When he got the opportunity, he took it with both hands. And yeah, I think around that time, I'm not saying, like, I've always been a big fan, and I've always respected Conor McGregor, but around that time I kind of got a bit sick of Conor McGregor and the way he was conducting himself, and just with the whole moving up to 170 pounds, and I'm gonna eat breakfast, I'm gonna eat good, and some of the stuff, I just remember some of the stuff that he was saying in the build up to the fight, or not even the build up to the fight, like during fight week, and the way he was behaving, it kind of rubbed me up the wrong way. And even if he hadn't said and done things that rubbed me up the wrong way, I still would have been, wanting Nate Diaz to win, just because I'd followed Nate Diaz's career for years and years and years, and I felt like he'd been overlooked a few times. A few times he got an opportunity, and he just lost the fight, like against Benson Henderson. Um, but I'd still had a soft spot for him, because he to this day, I need to stop doing that, but I can't help it. He's not he's never compromised who he is and what he stands for to get a step ahead in the sport of MMA, like you see people do day in day out nowadays. Like, he's genuinely kept it real for me throughout his career, and I respect that and I admire that, and I just like listening to him talk, and I like watching him fight, and for me, he's a genuine star. And that might just be because I'm a big fan of his, but I genuinely think he's got genuine star quality. So yeah, so that's another fight that sticks out in my memory. And the last one I want to talk about when it comes to MMA is when Michael Bisping beat Luke Rockhold. Um, that fight was, I wasn't expecting. I didn't think Michael Bisping was good enough, to be honest. Like, Michael Bisping is a guy whose career I've followed since kind of he made his UFC debut, and I've always been a fan of Michael Bisping, and he's always given me like really kind of entertaining moments as a British MMA fan, and I genuinely thought so. I'm looking at his Wikipedia page now because I just want to get the years right. So when he lost to um, Chael Sonnen, which was in 2012, I thought that was it. Like there's no way this man is ever going to become the middleweight champion. And then he managed to kind of, and then the Belcher fight, because this was a few fights later, he beat Alan Belcher, which was a bit like, at that time for some reason I thought that Belcher would beat him. Tim Kennedy beat Bisping, and then Luke Rockhold beat Bisping, guillotine choke, and then that was it. Then I thought, all right, he's just going to turn into a journeyman basically. And then when he fought CB Dollaway directly after, straight after the Luke Rockhold fight, for some reason I just thought CB Dollaway would beat him, and I thought that Michael Bisping was kind of on his way out. I thought he was on his way out, and then the Anderson Silva fight I thought was a nice little cherry on the cake of Michael Bisping. Like, all right, well, he hasn't won a world title, but I tell you what a crowning moment, what a way to go out. And then that was in February, and in the same year, 2016 June, Luke Rockhold, he goes in there and he knocks him out in the first round. And I've just never been a fan of Luke Rockhold. I don't know why. I can't. Again, it's similar to Gray Maynard because I'm pretty sure he's a nice guy. But I just remember like whenever Luke Rockhold fights, I always want his opponent to win, and I don't have a valid reason for it. I don't know why. I can't put my finger on it. I'm sure he's a nice guy because Daniel Cormier likes him, and Cain Velasquez likes him and stuff like that. So I'm sure he's a smashing bloke. But it's just me. I just don't gravitate towards him, I suppose. And obviously with Michael Bisping fighting him, I was supporting Michael Bisping, and I remember sitting in bed watching that fight in my room on TV, and I remember like punching my pillow a couple of times in excitement watching watching that fight, which is a bit geeky really. But yeah, that's how I reacted when he won that fight. Just quickly, some of my favourite fights in boxing. One that really sticks out is Amir Khan against Marcus Maidana, because I remember watching that fight on a dodgy stream because I can't, either it was on pay-per-view or it was on a channel in the UK that I didn't have, and the same night there was a UFC event going on, and I want to say it was GSP was fighting that night. Fucking hell, how do I remember that? Because I remember my mate was over, who lived on the same road as me, but he drove to my house, and I distinctly remember that. I think, why the fuck? It's literally a 3-minute walk, but he drove. But yeah, how am I gonna check this? All right, let me do this. I will Google Amir Khan Maidana, and that fight happened on 11th of December 2010. Right, so now what I'm going to do is UFC 11 December 2010. Oh, look at that. UFC 124. George St. Pierre against Josh Koscheck. Stefan Struve. Sean McCorkle, the curtain jerker. I remember him. But yeah, you guys can Google UFC 124. But I'm surprised I remembered that was the date that was the same day GSP fought Koscheck, and that was the day when GSP showed us this amazing jab he had, and he just jabbed the fuck out of Koscheck, didn't let him anywhere near. Koscheck kept trying to shoot. I remember this fight distinctly. He kept trying to shoot, and GSP was just there ramming a jab, and he fucked his eye up good and proper that day. But that boxing match, I remember watching that boxing match, and it was just it was an amazing fight, back and forth, exciting fight. I think Khan put Maidana down with a body shot early on, early on in like the first or second round, and then Maidana came back in the 9th or 10th, and he caught Amir Khan with a big shot. I remember Amir Khan did a chicken dance, and he was shaky, and he kept like kind of just circling around the outer perimeter of the ring, kind of just circling, but you could tell his legs were jelly. But then he kept like putting his arms up and showboating, kind of pretending like he's not hurt when you could clearly see he was hurt. And it was like, fucking put your hands in, like put your arms, don't hold your arms like that. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, protect yourself. Like, you're gonna get hit again. But yeah, that was a really exciting fight. That always stands out in my memory. Another fight that always stands out was Carl Froch against George Groves 1. Because during the build up to that fight, you had George Groves, who had recently split with his trainer, who I believe trained him from the day he turned pro to this point, to this fight, Adam Booth. And George Groves had taken on, I think, was it Paddy Fitzpatrick as his trainer. And Paddy Fitzpatrick was this Irish bloke with a really trendy beard, and he wore cool hats. And I loved listening to Paddy Fitzpatrick's interviews with IFL. He was just a character, and I just loved the way he spoke, and the things that he said. And obviously, I don't know how good of a trainer he is, because obviously George Groves didn't stick with him, and I'm not sure who he's training at the moment. But I remember him, for me, being a big part of the build-up of that fight. And then when that fight came around, you know, George Groves was a massive underdog, and like early doors, he knocked Carl Froch down in the first or second round, and everyone just had their mouths open, like, what the fuck, like, what's going on here? That was a crazy fight. And then obviously the second fight in front of 80,000 people, Carl Froch against George Groves, etc. But the first fight always sticks out in my mind. Another fight that I didn't watch live, and I don't remember it live, but I do remember when I kind of started getting more and more into boxing. I do remember kind of looking back at Prince Naseem Hamed, and if you got time, I think this is what kind of made me appreciate Prince Naseem Hamed more, because at the time my impression of Naseem Hamed was, this guy's big-headed. I didn't really like him. I just liked him as a fighter. I liked watching him fight, but I didn't like the way he spoke and acted, and I didn't like him as a person. But then I remember kind of looking back at his career, and when YouTube became a thing, basically going on this massive YouTube binge and watching stuff about Naseem Hamed, because he was always a character in the sport that always kind of stood out in my memory. And I remember watching this. If you go on YouTube and you type in Naseem Hamed, Lennox Lewis, BBC Sports Personality of the Year, there was this interview that Des Lynam, who was, if you're English, you'll know who Des Lynam is. He was the presenter of Match of the Day back in the day, a really cool guy with a moustache. And I'm pretty sure it was Des Lynam. I'm 99% certain it was Des Lynam interviewing Lennox Lewis and Naseem Hamed, who are both, I think, in the States, but separately doing kind of fight camps. Or one of them might have been in the UK or whatever. They were both in separate locations. It's all done via satellite. And they were both kind of talking. And I remember watching what Naseem Hamed was saying during that interview. And he kind of let his facade slip a couple of times, and he accidentally smiled when he was trying to be serious and stuff like that. And that kind of warmed me towards Prince Naseem Hamed. And then I saw this documentary that Sky Sports on YouTube again during the same binge that Sky Sports put together when Naseem Hamed made his debut, I believe, in the States, and it was against a boxer called Kevin Kelly. And that fight, Naseem Hamed against, I think it's Kevin Kelly. I don't want to get this wrong, because I can remember his outfit that he wore to the ring, Kevin Kelly, if that's his name. It was like green with massive collars, and I was like, I don't remember that ever being in fashion. But I'm just googling Naseem Hamed now. Give me a second. That fight that I'm talking about, Kevin Kelly. That was in 1997. So that was a while back. I would have been about 11 years old then. But I don't remember watching it live. I do remember watching it a few years afterwards. But yeah, that fight was, if it's on YouTube, it's one of the most exciting fights you'll ever see. And that was his debut in America. And if you're going to watch that fight, make sure you watch Nassim Hamid's ring walk as well, because that was crazy. that was as entertaining as a fight for me. And the commentary, what the commentators are saying in the background, that was also, it was their reaction to it. It was funny. Um, but yeah, those are some of my favorite kind of memories when it comes to boxing. Let me just see what else. What other questions? Favorite fights? Some fight recommend. And that's it. I think I'm. I don't even know. Oh bloody hell! I've been talking for an hour. It's crazy when you can talk to yourself for an hour. I hope this has been entertaining for people. I hope people have enjoyed listening to this. I'm gonna post this up on all the podcast stuff, channels and stuff tonight, so you'll have access to it tomorrow if you want to listen to it. And yeah, thanks. If you're still listening, fuck me, well done. Listening to me for an hour, just literally talk to myself. That's good going. Thanks for sharing this time with me. I appreciate it. Like I say, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, the all the different, to the podcast via the different platforms that are available to listen, that you listen to podcasts on, and feel free to follow me on Twitter and Instagram at the Battle Camp. And yeah, get in touch, man. If you've got any questions, any topics, anything like that you want me to talk about, just if you want to say hello, feel free to. That's the reason I'm doing this podcast, is because someone being Dara, asked me to ask kind of my early experiences with both sports, and I think I've covered it quite comprehensively. I've been sat here for an hour talking. I'm gasping. I need some water. I need some H2O. So I'll tell you what, let's leave it there. I'll catch you guys next time. Thanks for listening.